All right, great. Thanks so much. Thank you for having me. It is a pleasure to be part of this series, which I'm a huge fan of. I try to make it to most of these. And in addition, it's always a privilege to speak with scientists themselves, a lot of whom I know are here today, in the discipline about history. I really do feel very fortunate to be part of a community that's so willing to examine and re-examine questions of how we've come to know what we know about our evolutionary past. So with that in mind, I have to say I always learn a lot from these interactions. And so I hope for a really solid discussion at the end. And my goal is to provide some material for that good discussion. And I think we should have plenty of time there. So I look forward to that. So as Carrie said, I'm talking about Neanderthals today. I have to say this is based on a paper that I recently published in the journal Evolutionary Anthropology. And that piece itself was a spin on a paper I wrote for the Journal of the History of Biology last year. And I will provide citation information for those at the end of the talk. And you'll find more detail in there, and I'm happy to answer any questions and go into any more detail over email or otherwise. And that's all sort of at the end of the talk. All right, next slide. Can I do it? That's the question. There we go. Okay, so uncouth, repellent, the picture of unattractiveness. This portrayal of Neanderthals as unintelligent brutes, using words by the scientists themselves, is something I think most, if not all of us, are pretty familiar with. But where did this wildly pervasive idea come from? Why were Neanderthals portrayed as so, for lack of a better word, dumb for so long? And I should say, when I talk about portrayal today, I am speaking here not really about artistic renderings or paleoart, but instead my focus is really on the behavioral, the cultural, and intellectual qualities that were endowed by the scientists on the fossils. And I want to really try to get underneath what constituted the Neanderthal within the minds of the scientists. So when I say portrayal or image, I really mean concepts like uncouth and brutish that were then used to construct an image of who Neanderthals were and what they were like. And of course, those constructions were then used for paleoart and to communicate to a broader public. And there has been some really great work done on that, including Stephanie Moser's ancestral images here and many more. And so I want to gesture to that and say that that literature is certainly out there. And I will use a little bit of paleoart in this PowerPoint just to keep it kind of visually interesting. But I did just want to sort of have that caveat that I won't be delving that much into that today. So the scientific conception, the question is, where did that come from? And today I kind of want to explore this because I think there's a historical story that many of us have been told. It's sort of an origin story of the brutish Neanderthal, if you will. And it is a great story, but I'm extremely dissatisfied with it. And I'm certainly not alone in that. And I want to stress from the outset that I'm dissatisfied not because I want to tinker with the details of history and understandings of the past, but also because I think it has implications for the present. The way we think about this concept influences, I think, how we work on Neanderthals today. I think it has consequences for how we think about ourselves as humans and how we think about this extinct species, but also how we think about errors in science and indeed the process of science itself. And so I always like to give a roadmap of sort of where I'm headed in a talk. And so what I'm hoping is to explore this possibility of shifting our perspective on where the origins of the brutish Neanderthal concept comes from. And in order to do that, I'm going to do kind of a three-part story that focuses very heavily on the first recognized Neanderthal specimen. That's the Feldhofer 1 cranium from the Neanderthal, the Neander Valley. And so I'll do this kind of in three parts today. I'll first briefly review the origin story that I think many of us are familiar with by asking, what have we been told? And why do I see it as sort of problematic and incomplete? I think incomplete is probably a better word. And then I'll use that to kind of jump to the next point, which is, if I don't necessarily agree with the story we've been told, what story do I think, is a little bit more accurate or complete? And this is where we'll really meet the Feldhofer 1 fossil in detail. And then I want to use that to kind of bring this perspective to the present and connect it with a little bit of research that's been being done today. And I want to do that in order to ask a question that I think is really important in any history of science, and that's the so what question. Why should we care about this today? What does this perspective allow us to gain? And what I'm going to argue throughout the talk is basically the pretty basic fact that I think we need to really challenge ourselves when we're thinking about history to look deeper and take into account broader context. And specifically for today, a part of that context in the Neanderthal story, I will argue, is imperialism and also, interestingly, extinction, how we think about extinction. And I'll have to warn, I'm jumping back and forth a little bit between that origin story we've been told and then sort of what I think is maybe a more complete story. So hopefully I'm successful when I bring you with me on those jumps, but I try to keep them minimal. So now that we've got the roadmap, let's go ahead and dive right into what that origin story is. How did it come about? Why is it flawed? And why might this matter? So the story we've been told goes roughly like this. In the early 1900s, there was a skeleton found in France that ended up in the hands of French paleontologist Marcellin Boule. The specimen became known as the Old Man of La Chapelle, and this is a few views of the skull here, and there was also some postcrania that we'll see in the next slide. And Marcellin Boule completed a pretty epic study of this individual. It was one of the most complete examinations done to that day on a Neanderthal, and it was on one of the most complete skeletons that had been found. So it was quite detailed, and it ended up being quite influential. And certainly Marcellin Boule was a leading scientist of his time. And so what the study found was, in addition to sort of arguing that Neanderthals were not a direct relative ancestor of any sense, but in fact, kind of an extinct side branch, a cousin species of sorts. But in addition to that, what Boule found was that the Neanderthal was essentially a hunched over, stupid creature. And here's a picture of that hunched over stature from some of Boule's work on the left compared to a modern human standing up straight on the right, and then some of the postcrania from the old man as well. So as you can tell from the last couple sentences, this was a declaration that was about more than posture. It was also about cognitive capacity. These two things were in agreement. Boule said that Neanderthals did not display traces of any prehistoric occupation of aesthetic or moral kind, but and he saw this as quite in agreement with the brutish appearance of this clumsy body. They were shuffling, they were, unintelligent. They just weren't. They weren't quite as tall and complex as modern humans. So that's sort of the story we've been told of what Boule came to, and the story that I think a lot of us are familiar with, then tells us that there was a problem with this analysis, with Boule's analysis, and that was that the old man was, well, old, that he had arthritis, and that perhaps that arthritis may have actually been responsible for this hunched over posture, rather than some sort of idiocy or stupidity that was pervasive throughout the species. So we've been told that Boule incorrectly interpreted the old man's arthritic features as evidence for this crude, shuffling, hunched over beast. And this is a pretty serious error. This is an error that conflates the pathological deformity of a single individual with species-wide idiocy. So that's a big blunder, and one that's become known as Boule's error. And we've been told that this had grave consequences for the perception of Neanderthals. However, there are some problems with this, backing up. So here I should say this is a paleoart construction based on Boule's analysis, but it's one that we know Boule did not approve of, and I'm just kind of using it to illustrate the point here. So this legend of Boule's error, it's been repeated in textbooks, in popular histories of paleoanthropology, in histories of science, and like I said, it is a great story. Here's this one man who made this mistake on one skeleton, and the whole species gets cast off as, brutish. And scholars have actually worked a lot to try to explain how such an eminent scientist could have committed such a big mistake. They've used Boule as a cautionary tale for the dangers of basing conclusions on preconceived notions. They've also looked for explanations as to why he made this error, reaching for his political motivations or his institutional settings. And one scholar even looked for evidence of purposeful fraud in Boule's work to see if that could explain how he made this mistake. Now, all of this work, however, and the sort of overall narrative of Boule's error really often overlooks one crucial factor, it seems to me, and that is the half century of Neanderthal research that preceded Boule and his analysis of the old man. And so as many of us know, Boule's work all happened in the beginning of the 20th century, but the concept of a Neanderthal was much older. The original man from the Neander Valley, the Neanderthal man, was discovered in 1856. And this is a Feldhofer specimen. It's cranium pictured here. And this was first published by Hermann Schaffhausen, also pictured here, in the late 1850s. Now, a lot of work was done on this specimen, as again, many of us know. A man named George Busk, pictured centered here, had translated Schaffhausen's work into English and put it together with the Forbes quarry skull that we see on this image. And during all this, a lot of other naturalists were weighing in on what they thought the Feldhofer skull was and what they thought that meant for the intelligence of these creatures. And even it was during this time, but by the time the translation came about and the early publications came, including Thomas Huxley's pictured on the left here, that was a very influential piece. This was all now beginning of the 1860s. So again, still over 50 years before Boule is conducting his analysis. And for my PhD research, for part of my dissertation, I looked at the archives of a lot of these folks. And it became quite clear pretty quickly that some of these sentiments were being expressed early and frequently in the study of Neanderthals broadly, that Neanderthals were brutish and dumb. And this is true both in the publications that they produced about the fossils and then behind the scenes in the archives and a lot of the notes and the drawings that I was seeing. So for example, in the original paper, Schaffhausen speculated that Neanderthals were too crude to be capable of language at all, instead uttering sounds more like the cries of wild beasts than human speech. Huxley made claims that it was difficult to believe the skull could have contained anything more complex than thoughtless brains. And even the geologist who chose the name of Homo neanderthalensis in 1863, William King, argued that the thoughts and desires which once dwelt within the Neanderthal cranium never soared beyond those of a brute. So we can see these are pretty widespread sentiments about Neanderthal intelligence. Moreover, there was an entire group of naturalists who argued quite literally that the fossil cranium represented a diseased or a maldeveloped idiot. So maybe then this suggests that the brutish Neanderthal concept isn't so much about Boule, if this is going on 50 years before the old man of La Chapelle was even dug up. So the question is then, I think, what is going on here? How did this originate? And I want to mention that I think that question is particularly important in light of the fact that naturalists did not agree upon what they thought the Neanderthal was. Yet they agreed on the supposed stupidity of the Neanderthals. So there were, as Arthur Keith later said, almost as many speculations on the nature of the Feldhofer individual as there were anthropologists in Europe. So we had a range of opinions about whether this cranium was a modern human and just an extreme variation of it, or was it something else entirely, like William King thought when he named the new species. So you had this kind of spectrum of opinions about what the Neanderthal was, whether it was human or non-human. Yet, no matter where someone fell in that spectrum, they made comments about its unintelligent nature. And so the question, I think, becomes why? Which requires going to the next slide. And this is where our discussion gets challenging, I think, but it's a kind of challenge that it's imperative to confront, it seems to me. And that's the context of the 19th century study of humans, which was the era of scientific racism. So I want to just mention that in the discussion of race that follows, as many anthropologists on this Zoom call and many others know, it's worth highlighting that it's clear today that the concept of race does not accurately represent human biological variation in any way. Data from human genomics and evolutionary biology have indisputably revealed that variation doesn't map onto modern populations and doesn't have roots in biological reality. Biological anthropologists have demonstrated that this seemingly biological classification system that was used in the 19th century was in fact a culturally constructed system that emerged from and in support of European colonialism, oppression, and discrimination. And it thus carried numerous cultural stereotypes and biases, which we'll explore a little bit today. So race is not real in any sort of biological sense. And moreover, any of the callous 19th century terminology of declaring human populations as these derogatory terms of savage or lowly or even brutish is also not based in any sort of scientific reality we now know. And it's something I've tried to cut out of this talk as much as possible. So now that we've established that, let's just look at the 19th century briefly. So at the time that the first Neanderthal was discovered, the Feldhofer Neanderthal, there was already a lot of work going on modern humans. And European naturalists were engrossed in this task of comparing and categorizing the anatomies, the cultures, and the behaviors of humans across the globe. And this was driven by colonial expansion. As they came into contact with new populations, they started looking at variations in behavior, in anatomy, all of these differences that we now know are just variations. And they conceived at the time of these differences in diversity as these categories of races, these fixed categories that they imagined fitting neatly into a linear chain that sort of mirrored colonial hierarchies and ideas of progress. So that chain meant for them that apes were at sort of the lower end, and then Europeans were at the top, and any sort of marginalized or colonialized people in the middle. And this progress-infused evolutionary thinking that really took hold in the 1860s after Darwin published just kind of took this idea and added an evolutionary twist to this. So naturalists began to imagine colonized people as links in that chain in an evolutionary sense that linked them to early human ancestors, who were themselves links to the rest of the primate world. And so what ended up happening was contemporary marginalized populations became viewed as analogous to primitive ancient humans. And this framework assumed a lot of things, including, importantly, connections between scientific concepts like biology and culture. And a lot of really interesting history of science work has been done on this that I point to in my publications. So someone's cultural complexity or their cognitive ability or even their morality could be inferred from bones because these things were so intricately connected in this framework. And of course, this is a concept that had enormous implications. So this classification system that was already in existence for living populations at the time actually became stamped on the study of Neanderthals in very specific ways. It was within this framework that the first Neanderthal was examined. And I just want to say that, this wasn't vague. This wasn't some vague, like look at anatomy being linked to culture. But in fact, the link between biology and culture were located in very particular features, mostly of the skull. These were anatomical markers that became signifiers of inferiority or superiority. And this association has been called by historians of science a quite distinctive racism. And so there were particular anatomical markers that European naturalists believed signify inferiority, again, before the Neanderthal was ever found. And they happened to be characters that the Neanderthal did indeed display. And so I'll single out one particular anatomical feature to illustrate this, and that's the forehead. A low brain case and flattened forehead was already kind of considered a feature that was brutish, and we can see this in the literature. And so scientists who examined the Feldhofer Neanderthal commented on this explicitly, all of them. And here's an image from Thomas Huxley's 1863 publication, Man's Place in Nature, where he puts the Neanderthal cranium over a marginalized living population to sort of illustrate the similarities. And he comments on it. And as does everyone else, the species namer King found that the forehead, quote, was uncommonly low and retreating. And this was a feature that told him that the skull was neither human nor intelligent because, quote, man's physical endowments are visibly expressed by the elevated vertex of his cranium. The significance of the forehead for intelligence was so widely agreed upon at the time that a few years later, Charles Darwin in Descent of Man acknowledged, quote, it is commonly said that the forehead gives man his noble and intellectual appearance. So without a forehead, a Neanderthal could not be noble or intellectual because of this framework that was ongoing. And this photo from the archives is just one example of how contemporary ideas surrounding the study of living humans in the imperial era drove naturalists to initial interpretations of the fossil. And it's one that I think is a little bit easy to visualize, even if it's a little bit difficult to really see what's going on here. This is from Huxley's archives, and it is a comparison of the Neanderthal, which is outlined in yellow and kind of has one of the more forward brows in this picture. And he's comparing it to gorillas and all different kinds of humans. He has an Englishman on there, an Australian, an American, and even a Scotch idiot. And so this image, which is sobering, shows us that Huxley was comparing features like the forehead and the vault shape and the overall size in order to see if this approach could shed light on the Neanderthal. And if you think about all of the sort of assumptions that were coming with it that I'm mentioning about culture, this is, an image that carries quite a bit of weight. So many years after seeing all of these things in the archives, I then turned to the literature later in my PhD. Fortunately, there was some really solid work that did discuss this phenomenon of the pre-Boule brutish Neanderthal, and it's tied to race science of the 19th century. So for example, in Evolutionary Anthropology, Trinkus and Shipman talk about this back in 1993, when they declared that Neanderthals were, quote, children of the 19th century, and were thus shaped by the science of human races trending at that time. So the perspective isn't totally new, yet the myth of Boule's error still persists, I should add. But importantly, a lot has happened in the history of science since 1993, which has helped illustrate how these ideas developed in European colonial science and how scientific and cultural ideas were mutually reinforcing across time. And so what I have then been focusing on the last few years in this realm is really trying to bring together those new developments in the history of science and the history of racial science of the 19th century into conversation with works like this, and see how the Neanderthal fits into this broader discussion of the science of human races from that time, to see if there's more that we can learn. And in doing so, a couple of things have become more clear, which I want to mention. First is the specific type of racism that I already mentioned, the way that this was really tied to particular characters, and the way that culture was stamped directly onto biology. But also, one thing I want to look at more closely in the next few minutes, which is thanks to broader work on the history of science in colonial science and in extinction, is digging deeper into these imperial worldviews actually allows us to examine the role that extinction plays in this narrative. And what I mean here is that racial categorizations have always been really political. That's important to not forget. The mid-19th century association between these Neanderthals and the living marginalized people had profound cultural and political implications. And by that, I mean, if the living marginalized population was perceived as culturally or intellectually inferior, this reasoning implied, it was easier to justify imperial expansion and even extinction of those groups of people. And this becomes really clear when we look at how extinction was being talked about during this time. So at the time, extinction was considered to really be a marker of progress. It's about as different from how we think about extinction today as you can imagine, and I'll talk a little bit about that. This was thought to be something that occurred sort of gradually and inevitably because evolution was a little bit progressive. So evolution was working towards betterment, which we know today is not how we think about evolution at all. And so this logic, though, this 19th century imperial logic, made it justifiable to really subjugate and even exterminate so-called marginalized people, because these groups were seen to be doomed anyway due to their inferiority. The assumption meant that these groups were sort of self-extinguishing. And historian Patrick Brantlinger has labeled this viewpoint as extinction discourse. And he describes this as a specific branch of the dual ideologies of imperialism and racism. And again, I know these are sort of difficult topics, but for reasons that will become clear, I think they're worth confronting rather than avoiding. Embedding Neanderthals into this worldview actually provided evidence for the worldview. Because it added further justification for the continued European expansion. Because Neanderthals were no longer around, the logic went, then therefore they must have been unable to compete with the more progressive humans. And so viewed as these kind of lowly beings because of this cultural biological connection, Neanderthals' demise really afforded the first tangible fossil evidence that the process of extinction in the name of evolutionary betterment had already been occurring before colonial expansion, and therefore really justified its continuation into the present. And this is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about a mutual reinforcement of science and cultural attitudes. This is an example of how, as Chris Manius, a historian of science, has argued, scientists really use the past as an ideological and political tool to comprehend social processes, reinforce value systems, and assert authority of particular groups. Again, what we know from the history of science is that this was often not on purpose, right? A lot of these scientists were not going out and saying, we're going to find evidence that, there was an extinct species of humans, or and so that we can justify European expansion. But what we know is that the lens through which we are asking questions about the fossil record is heavily influenced by our current situation. And so it's really more of this underlying assumptions that's informing this worldview. So I also want to mention that hopefully it's starting to become clear that this wasn't really just about Neanderthals. This was about modern humans as well, or even as they were thinking about it, modern Europeans, and their relationship with Neanderthals and other living creatures. And this is where I think it gets quite interesting. The attitudes on extinction at the time reveal how naturalists viewed themselves as part of nature and as potential drivers of change. So thinking through a world of possible imperialist-driven extinction required grappling with the really important question of how to situate humans within the biological world and determine, as Huxley called it, our relation to the universe of things. So leaving responsibility for extinction generally with nature by assuming that this was a process that was completely natural and progressive and just an outcome of evolutionary processes, irrespective of human action, this self-extinguishing narrative relieved Europeans of any kind of culpability in the imperialist atrocities that were unfolding around the globe. And so thus notions of extinction, progress, race, and humans' place within and their impact on nature broadly were all really closely intertwined. And so if we take this understanding and then move it forward, we take with us this recognition that the understandings of race and extinction played a role in conceptions of Neanderthals. I think this allows us to start to trace how those ideas change across time. And we see these sentiments actually carried forward through the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century. For example, there's many examples of continued discussions of Neanderthals as sort of not being able to compete with humans and that playing a role in their extinction. And there's a lot in the early 20th century, there's a lot of really direct comparisons between the Neanderthal extinction and extinction of marginalized people that Europeans understood to be happening at the time. But then we even see this in Boule's analysis. There were certain patterns that were set forward in this 19th century viewpoint that continued into the 20th century. So patterns set forward by people like Schaffhausen and Huxley, but of course were used by a much wider group. And we see this actually in Boule's analysis of the La Chapelle specimen. He continued to focus on the same groups of marginalized people that Huxley focused on and made his comparisons directly therein, using certain groups as benchmarks for what he considered primitive humans and as proxies for both intelligence, morality, culture, and posture even. And so like those before him, Boule really, if you trace, there's a lot of following of the same patterns. He even did things like point to the forehead as evidence for Neanderthal unintelligence in the case of the old man from La Chapelle. The species Boule claimed had failed to acquire, quote, the principal characteristic of true Homo sapiens, fully developed foreheads and large brains. And as I move into the 20th century, I have to give a brief caveat, which is that, as we all know, a lot happened between the 1860s and now me jumping close to 1910, 1911 with Boule's analysis. And I should say there's some great work done on that. And there also is a lot of variation that's going on. There's a lot of different ways that scientists are thinking about Neanderthals, including the one I have pictured here, which was inspired by anatomist Arthur Keith in the 20th century. And it looks a lot more human-like than some of the other reconstructions that were coming out. And indeed, this is because Arthur Keith thought of Neanderthals as much more human-like and therefore more advanced and less brutish. And I highlight these because they definitely exist. And some of my paper deal with it a little bit, but if you want to trace really the Neanderthal story without skipping, like I kind of am here, from the 1860s forward, there's great work, including The Changing Image of Humankind by Trinkus and Shipman. And we can always talk about this in questions afterwards. But the reason I'm sort of jumping ahead here is that I'm trying to argue that the imperial era really persisted into the early decades of the 20th century, and with them those narratives of progressive evolution and racial differences and superiority of modern humans, and particularly modern Europeans, endured. And I think that was the case even though there was variation with things like Arthur Keith. I think this was still very much the dominant narrative in the early decades of the 20th century. And while researchers in the 20th century, like Boule, added tons of new facets to Neanderthal research with new analyses and new specimens, what I'm trying to argue is that the work really built on the themes set forward by Huxley and others in really important ways, and that are really easy to trace over time. So that's what I'm trying to emphasize there. And I'm doing that because if we keep then tracing this intertwined thread of race, extinction, and Neanderthals into the middle of the 20th century, we start to really see something interesting. And that is that all of these ideas break down around the same time. So by the 1940s, this was the decline of imperialism. And at this time, the inevitability of extinction, that progressive, gradual, and almost fair way of looking at it, really started to break down. It became as much contested as conceded broadly in science, and this is work by other historians of science. And with it, the race theory itself was headed toward extinction. As we know, by the mid to late 1940s, it was a very different picture for how scientists were talking about human races for really important scientific and cultural reasons. And without pervasive assumptions about the inferiority of certain living populations, once that became harder to hold on to, the inevitability of expansion by certain groups stopped dominating the scientific discourse. And it became no longer as easy to just assume that certain groups were doomed to extinction. Coinciding, of course, with these broader shifts and concepts of race and extinction, a change occurred in the leading narratives about Neanderthal intelligence and their ultimate demise. At this exact time, this is when you start to see what Trinkus and Shipman have called the Renaissance of Neanderthals in the second half of the 1940s. This was a time when the species began to be perceived as somewhat more human-like and familiar, which is a trend that I would argue has continued to the present day. Particularly, it was during this time that Strauss and Cave declared that if a Neanderthal could be reincarnated and placed in the New York subway, it's doubtful whether it would attract any more attention than any of the other people on the subway. So famously, I have to add, this statement was derived from a re-examination of the specimen that Boule had studied decades earlier, the La Chapelle specimen, and we'll come back to that. So transformations in ideas about extinction and actually biodiversity as well only became more pronounced from the 1940s onwards. And here I'm trying to kind of draw a line from that point up to the present, more or less. And there's been some really interesting history of science work, including by David Sapkowski, that's shown that as paleontologists increasingly started to look at rapid mass extinctions in the fossil record broadly, and at the same time, ecologists increasingly started to argue that biodiversity was of value in and of itself. These two things allowed scientists to move away from any kind of mid-19th century view of extinction as inevitable, progressive, or fair. Adopting this perspective, which was happening in the 1960s and into the 1970s, a perspective that recognizes sort of catastrophic extinction events and views them as tragedies rather than moments of progress, this does something very different to our perspective of what extinction means. And importantly, it leaves room for human agency, while also laying the groundwork for a robust set of ecological and humanist values. So suddenly, if species are not self-extinguishing due to inferiority, who is doing the extinguishing? So I want to use that sort of broader look at extinction and biodiversity to ask, how then does the perception of human agency in extinction shape our understandings of Neanderthals' disappearance from the planet today? And I raise the question of, is it possible that changing assumptions surrounding race and extinction have played a significant role in framing scientists' ideas about Neanderthals and maybe continue to play a significant role? And I say this because although a range of opinions, of course, currently exist regarding the potential causes of Neanderthal demise, the notion that they were inevitably headed towards extinction simply due to their own brutishness is, of course, no longer the dominant narrative. Instead, the picture is far more nuanced and invokes external factors like climate change quite frequently, though, of course, this is highly debated. So this all seems to me that this is a trend, this Neanderthal renaissance, that brings us to kind of a position that we're at today. As Neanderthals became increasingly portrayed as intelligent beings capable of crafting cave art and jewelry, the tone of the discussions of Neanderthal extinctions has shifted. But as I'm trying to argue, this was a very broad shift that then influenced how we think about Neanderthals. So instead of invoking modern human superiority today, as we know, a lot of researchers have begun to envision Neanderthals as sort of an alternative way of being human. This is a very different look than the 19th century. For some researchers, it's even possible to envision Neanderthals as having been victims of Homo sapiens expansion and the accompanying loss of biodiversity, including megafauna. So within these hypotheses, these labels of modern humans as kind of invaders indicate a very different set of assumptions from the 19th century concerning what drives extinction and what extinction means and who is at fault. And so it's worth noting that through these conceptions of Neanderthals in the 21st century, we also have this new addition to the ways we think about Neanderthals, and that's the fact that there's evidence now for interbreeding between them and modern humans. And how that integration has influenced the conception of Neanderthals, in addition to the things I'm mentioning, like race and extinction and imperialism and biodiversity, that needs further examination, it seems to me, but it cannot go without mentioning, because of course it's going to alter the ways that we think about the capacity of these creatures. And so when inspecting these modern conceptions of Neanderthals, then it's worth remembering that the past conceptions have been influenced by those contemporary understandings of diversity, extinction, and humans' relationship with nature. And maybe this is helpful in the recognition that now we're in the Anthropocene. So as the historian Dave Sapkowski summarizes, quote, the way that we understand the relationship between humans and the rest of the natural world, and how we conceive of ecological relationships, geological processes, and evolutionary dynamics informs the type of scientific questions that we ask, including our anxieties about the present and the future, and the basic values that guide our interactions. So we've seen how those have shifted and how that can kind of shape the way that we are not only the assumptions that are going into the research, but even just the question formation out at the outset. And so just kind of like bring this back to my original narrative in question. In summary, what I've tried to do briefly here is to show that the caricature of Neanderthals as brutish was pervasive throughout the 19th century and into the 20th, and that it was deeply tied to colonial extinction narratives. And I'm also trying to show that the conception of Neanderthals therefore shifted as those other assumptions and worldviews shifted, reinforcing the science and cultural interplay that is ongoing. And I want to use this to kind of ask one final question before I conclude that brings us back to the original point of this talk, which is, if this is the case, if I have convinced any of you today that the Neanderthal caricature is a product of the 19th century, then that raises the question of why has Boule been held responsible for this depiction of Neanderthals as unintelligent brutes? And, you know, that original depiction, I think, was born, there's a lot of answers to this, it's a short answer, but we really began to ask this question when Strauss and Cave reevaluated The Old Man of La Chapelle almost half a century after Boule originally did it, and they found evidence that this stooped posture was potentially attributable to arthritis. And that's when the sort of narrative of Boule's error was born. But at the time, those two authors pleaded with scientists, quote, not to criticize Boule too harshly. Instead, they emphasized his study must be placed in its proper historical setting. And they added that the brutish notion of Neanderthals, quote, undoubtedly goes back to the discovery of the holotype, the Feldhofer 1 fossil. I would argue that we have not heeded their warning. So again, if the question is why, a number of reasons have been put forward, and this is something I think about that keeps me awake at night. But one reason that has been put forward is just severely the enormous weight that Boule's scholarship had on the discipline. But more interestingly, maybe, as one historian of science has posited, Marianne Sommer, that maybe there was an influence by the intense circulation of materials, of textbooks, of newspapers and magazines across Europe around the time that Marcellin Boule was publishing these things. And therefore, it just sort of became more embedded in an international narrative. There's also the possibility that illustrations like the shaggy primitive Neanderthal that I showed earlier, which is based on Boule's work, that those had quite significant implication. And again, that's tied to circulation. And that could be the case even if Boule disliked the image. So there are some possibilities to think about maybe why this became such a strong historical narrative. But it is also possible, I think, that the popularity of this story of Boule's error was so great because it is truly a great story. It's so simple, it's so tidy. It's often how I think we were originally taught science was done, right? By one sole individual who's either right or wrong. And I think we all know that the process of science is more complex than that. So I don't mean to absolve Boule completely. I mean, did Boule think Neanderthals were dumb? Yes. Did he expand the sort of current definition of Neanderthals to the postcrania more than anyone ever had before? Yes. But was this a merciless characterization, as I quoted earlier, of the species that almost single-handedly revolutionized the way scientists think about Neanderthals? I've tried to argue today that the answer to that, for me, is a resounding no. So dismantling the narrative of Boule's error, then, I would argue, is not simply an exercise in kind of correcting minor details of history, but instead it's one that really matters. I think there's danger in reproducing tales like that of Boule's error. By blaming Boule and reproducing the story of this single biased scientist, this tidy story, we rip the brutish Neanderthal from its historical context, and we obscure the larger picture and wash out the pervasive racial assumptions that were involved in the early studies of the deep human past and the profound implications of those assumptions. And I think that is a mistake to allow those to get swept under the rug by adopting this narrative of Boule's error. So to just sort of wrap up, one quote that I come back to often is archaeologist Robin Donnell once argued that perhaps one of the main lessons to absorb from the history of science is the danger of too many people becoming too comfortable for too long with an idea just because so many agree with it and have agreed with it so often in the past. So the brutish Neanderthal might be a good example of that kind of concept with its widespread acceptance and persistence from the 19th century into the mid-20th. But maybe a similar lesson can be applied to the narratives that we construct from history. When certain ideas about science's history become entrenched, like Boule's error, we become really comfortable with them, which I think is a mistake because it flattens the rest of the potential historical story. And with that in mind, I'll just conclude by saying, by taking the Feldhofer specimen's role in the conception of the brutish Neanderthal seriously, I think we start to see how it was constructed on assumptions about the process of nature from evolution to extinction, and importantly, humans' place in that process. Again, this perspective offers new possibilities for us to critically examine ideas in the present. We are today in the Anthropocene, and we are more aware of it than ever. Narratives of that inevitable rise of Homo sapiens have been replaced with a kind of anxiety about vanishing nature and biodiversity. And I think it's possible to think that this is even influencing the way that we think about our own lineage and hominin diversity before it became just one species. And so as we ask questions about sort of prehistoric encounters and extinctions, in the case of Neanderthals or Denisovans or any other species, then I would encourage us to remember that understandings of our place in nature, that topic that Huxley once called the question of questions for humankind, our relations to the universe of things, are really shaped by a very tangled web of ideas that reflect how we understand ourselves, how we understand our past, our present, but also how we understand our future. So with that, I'll just say thank you. I appreciate everyone's attention. It's so wonderful to see you all here today, and I welcome any and all questions over Twitter or email or in the few minutes we have left. And then I did also promise that I would provide citations for the papers that I've been mentioning. So there are those briefly, but you're always welcome to email me for those as well. So thanks.
Thank you, Paige. That was Really, really interesting. I actually really enjoyed that. So Chris Stringer's just said in the chat, oh, if you want to stop sharing your screen as well, hopefully everyone got those references. But yeah, Chris Stringer's just put, in search of the Neanderthals, Clive Gamble and I pointed out how influential, the Boule image was in early 20th century fiction, such as Quest for Fire and H.G. Wells' The Grizzly Folk. And then he says, great talk, by the way.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thanks, Chris. And you know, I mean, that's just such a good example of this circulation, I think, that was going on in the 20th century that just wasn't possible before. I mean, you suddenly have Neanderthals bleeding into fiction, which is so powerful. I mean, you know, that's what a lot of people today are kind of left with, this image of Neanderthals based on what they've read in some of these fictional works. And those are really important examples. And I think that's important because it could suggest, it doesn't necessarily suggest, but it could suggest that one of the reasons why Boule's perspective was so powerful is maybe not as related to the science as it is the historical, you know, moment that the science happened. I think it's probably a little bit of both, but I think it's important to recognize that it's a little bit of both, right? That this was just one perspective that, for example, Arthur Keith didn't agree with, but it became the dominant one. So I really appreciate that. And that's such a great example of how paleoanthropologists doing history is so important and so great, and why I love these talks, and you know, why I always learn so much. So I appreciate that.
Cool. So the next question in the chat, and I'm sorry in advance if I absolutely butcher your name, but Kenny Lowe says, in terms of representation, what are your thoughts on the Flintstones? So how are children viewing this past? Were the cartoon designed in accordance to 19th century Neanderthal imagery, and will this change going forward with regards to representation and hominin or hominid discoveries in Africa?
That's a great question. Thank you, and thanks for coming. Yeah, there's a lot to that question. One is that, you know, this caveman, this, you know, almost like Neanderthals are the European species, right? I mean, that's how they're thought of in popular culture, at least, even though we know they weren't constricted to Europe. But, you know, this sort of European caveman message is so pervasive. And, you know, I think we all do. I meet people all the time who, when I say, especially here in Denmark, but I mean, everywhere really, people, you know, they hear the word Neanderthal and it sounds familiar, and they have this image of this caveman that's either Flintstone-like or otherwise. And they don't quite know what to make of it, but I guess their assumption is often that this is an ancestor. And so what you're suggesting here with, you know, everything that's going on in Africa and South Africa is that, as we know, that's very different from the reality. And there's a whole huge human evolutionary narrative that's not being communicated, I think, particularly to Europeans who have just kind of heard this word being thrown around. And so to answer your question based on that really pervasive assumption, my true answer is I don't know. But my other answer is, like, I don't know how we're going, or like if we're going to change this moving forward. But I do know if we are, it's going to take a lot of very deliberate work. And it's, you know, I think it's difficult work, and it has to be very much on purpose. So for example, I recently visited a temporary exhibition that's being held here in Denmark on Neanderthals that's working really hard to, you know, reconstruct this idea of Neanderthals. And, you know, I think it's the first time that a lot of people are coming face to face with this conception, even though there are documentaries and there are books and things like that. But I'm not sure that the average, you know, public are still coming into contact with that. So there's the reshaping of Neanderthals, but then there's also, like you mentioned, like, how do we continue to educate the public and get them excited about human evolution more broadly, and particularly, you know, the fact that so much of the story happened in Africa. And I'm at the Natural History Museum of Denmark, and so my response has to be that museums, I think, play a big role in that. And we are building a new museum here, and there will be a human evolution gallery. That these are major concerns of ours. And I know a lot of other people working on human evolution galleries and outreach events similarly. You know, how do you get the average person from Denmark to really get excited about their deep history in Africa? I think the answer to that is stay tuned, but we also have to work together, and I'll drop the comment at that, but we can talk about it later as well.
Okay, so next question is from James, who says, thank you. Do you think there has been an overcorrection, i.e. scholars have begun to overstate Neanderthal abilities, etc., to compensate for their unfair depiction in the past?
Yeah, thanks for that question. That's a very direct question that I kind of talk around, as you might tell. I think if I had to answer that question, I would say yes. As a historian of science, I'm so critical of the way that that corrections happen in science. And it seems to me that the pendulum has swung so far in the other direction that if I was just looking at it from a history of science perspective, it would make me wonder if the pendulum has hit the other end and we may end up somewhere a little bit more in the middle. But that being said, I have been wrong before. I'm not a Neanderthal expert. You know, I'm not on the forefront of the sort of the research on Neanderthal abilities. And I think the answer will end up being somewhere in the middle. But I do think that it's easy to overstate and to overcompensate in the other direction because this depiction was so unfair and so extreme. And so I think it's really easy to kind of just try to go 180 degrees. And I wonder if that's really the reality. But I think, you know, we learn more on Neanderthals all the time. So hopefully that question will be more and more answered. And I think, you know, it would be closer to the modern perspective than certainly than the 19th century perspective. But I think we still have a ways to go on that. But that's just my personal opinion.
So then Walters asked, in the early 1800s, von Humboldt thought natives were advanced, able to cope with their universe very well, and were as smart as Europeans. So did any of the subsequent naturalists study his works or consider his opinions and theories?
Yeah, that's a good question. And the true answer is I'm not sure, because Humboldt was, you know, he was the most famous scientist at the time. He was what we consider Darwin today. You know, he was very influential, and people like Darwin and Huxley and all of them not only read his work, but sort of worshiped it. And he, you know, he did a lot of really important things. However, when I study Darwin's, you know, for example, Darwin's work on other populations or Huxley's, I do not see that replicated. And some really interesting work on that has been done in a recent book looking at 150 years since Descent of Man was published. That's an edited volume by Jeremy De Silva. And there are certain chapters that delve really deep into how Darwin, for example, thought about races. And yeah, his opinion was a lot darker than Humboldt's, which is unfortunate. And maybe things would have worked out a little bit differently if he had followed Humboldt a little bit more. Not to say there aren't a lot of naturalists that contributed to this narrative, but his voice was quite heavy.
Okay, so Christian has asked, do you have any sense of any errors of perception that we might currently be making today that are analogous to the imperialism/racism that influenced the perception of Neanderthals?
That's a really good question. Thanks for asking that. It is, you know, that's the thing about the history of science, is that it is so easy to go back and look at, the further you are from a time period, the more glaring those influences become, honestly. And the closer you get to the present, the harder it is to see what's going on, because these things, the way that culture influences science, they are continuous. I mean, we're learning a ton. The science of Neanderthals is absolutely fascinating. The technology is amazing. We're definitely learning. I don't want to be a cultural relativist here. And I say that in some of the papers, and Trinkus and Shipman do as well. So I do think we are getting closer to an understanding of who Neanderthals were, for sure. But culture will never not play a role, in my opinion, in science. And that may even go down to question formation, I think. Like the types of questions we think to ask, I think are influenced by our worldview. And so the answer is, for me, and I think for a lot of historians of science, it becomes really hard to look at today and say, this is what is influencing us today, much like racism and imperialism do in the past. It's really tough, and I don't think we can do it well. However, I would say that the dramatic shift that we've had in the last century on ideas about imperialism and racism, just the 180 we've taken there. I mean, there's still a lot of work to be done to sort of live in a more equal and more post-colonial society, but the sort of difference in attitude, I think is worth paying attention to. And that's a little bit of what I tried to draw in. And then my final answer to that question, which I sort of alluded at, is I think the Anthropocene. I think there is no way for us to be living in the scientific world that we're living in today and not have that infiltrate everything we do, honestly. I mean, the scientists are more aware than the average population of what humans have done to the planet. And I don't think that an understanding like that is not going to like shape ideas and question formation. And so I think even that question of, did humans cause the extinction of Neanderthals? That is a relatively recent question to be asked. We did not see that question until the mid-19th or the mid-20th century at least, and then it becomes sort of more prevalent. But I don't think you can even think to ask that question until you come to an understanding, like I've kind of tried to argue, that humans do cause extinctions sometimes, and that extinctions are rapid, and that biodiversity is a good thing that we value, and all of these things that we're learning about the ways humans interact with our world. So for me, the Anthropocene really shows us that there's no way to kind of differentiate the science of the past with what's going on in the present and how we imagine the future, but that's not a bad thing. And it may be that humans did play a major role in Neanderthal extinction. I'm not saying that perception is like incorrect because it's shaped by the Anthropocene. It might be correct. It might turn out to be correct. But I do think it's worth recognizing what assumptions are going into that in order for us to kind of do a better science. And that's what I always say whenever I'm talking to scientists, is that the best I think we can do is try to lay all of our assumptions out on the table. And that's the closest I think we can get to recognizing those errors in perception that you mentioned that we might be making today. Because if we keep those, that's hard to do, but if we keep those assumptions to ourselves, I think that's when we really risk going off track. And yeah, so that's kind of my answer, the Anthropocene.
That was a really good answer, thank you. So we have another minute if anyone would like to ask another question before we finish up for the day. Oh, okay, so Rick has just said, great presentation and regards from the Neanderthal Museum. When we at the museum ask pupils about Neanderthals, they often compare them rather with apes or chimpanzees rather than humans. How do you think we can change that perception?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I see the same thing when I share, when I've shared certain pictures from that Neanderthal exhibition that I mentioned here in Denmark or something, I get those comments online. And yeah, you do when you're walking around a museum, you often hear it. My true answer is, I don't know, but I think that those of us who are really involved in the science need help if we want to change that perception. I don't think we can do it alone. And that's something I've learned from working in a museum setting, is that I'm sort of too close to the topic. I can begin to think about how to communicate some ideas to the public, but I need to constantly be bouncing those ideas off of other people who have different focuses, maybe know nothing about the science, maybe know a ton about what research museums have produced about what works and what doesn't work in exhibitions. Those types of expertise of how people learn and how to best communicate scientific ideas. Because one thing I've really been humbled in thinking that I by myself can do it. I think we all are getting better at it as a community, and paleoanthropologists certainly are constantly doing outreach events, but I think asking for help from experts outside the discipline that might be able to provide other ways of thinking about how to communicate this is probably, again, the only way to move forward.
Okay, thank you. So that's it for today then. Thank you, Paige, for a really interesting talk, and thanks everyone for coming along. I hope to see you all back next week for a talk by Dr. Laura Buck on the role of hybridization in hominin morphology. So yeah, thanks again, everyone, and bye for now.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.